Now, I know none of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will admit to being racist, and I don't think they are. But when you look at the rhetoric and you hear the talking points and look at the legislation that's put forward, what are we to say?
They're cowards. They're all cowards. They won't do anything to save the lives of our children at all. Cowards. Pressure them. Force them to respond to the question, why the hell won't you do anything to save America's children? And let them explain that all the way up until election day on 2024. I'm talking about gun violence.
In a school that allows teachers to carry.
Oh my God. Carry guns? You think more guns lead to more death? More guns lead to more death. Look at the data. You're not looking at any data.
The trans community isn't bothering you. Let them live. Why are Republicans so uncomfortable with this? Let them be who they are. That's it. They're not bothering you. They're not taking your lunch money. They're not criminalizing your communities. They're not engaging in gun violence. They just want to live and be happy like everyone else. And they are contributing members to society, whether it's through education, sports, the economy, or anything else.
I believe this is the greatest domestic policy error, the most consequential domestic policy error in the modern history of this country. What the shutdowns did, if there's any silver lining at all, is it opened a lot of eyes to the way our education establishment works, that it's really not about the kids. In a state like California, it's never about the kids.
Also, Dr. Malkus, the left will concede that the pandemic caused learning loss. However, the evidence suggests that learning loss is far worse than it should have been because the Democrat politicians and their teacher union allies kept schools closed far longer than what was necessary.
The way the brain works, it doesn't work in a way where learning is lost. That implies that you need to go find it. That implies that it's somewhere that it can't be located. Learning doesn't happen at a period of time in a vacuum and then you move on and then you can't get it back unless you go find it. It may have been disrupted, yes, because we experienced a trauma that is unprecedented in world history. And that's a word that no one has used up until this point. Trauma. There is another pandemic that has been going on since the beginning of American history. And that is the underinvestment and disinvestment in poor schools, in poor communities, particularly black and brown. Because of historic miseducation and separation and segregation across race and class, we continue to have these battles rooted in sexism, racism, and discrimination. We continue to have an economy that doesn't work for all Americans. When we invest in education, we invest in shared prosperity from rural America to urban America and everything in between. Imagine a nation where every single child, regardless of learning style, background, race, had access and opportunity to the American dream. When we invest in education, we have better health care, economic, and obviously education outcomes. We deal with the issue of public safety. We deal with the issue of mass shooting. We deal with the issue of mass incarceration. Invest in our children, invest in our schools. Let us stop neglecting this critical area.
DeSantis doesn't have a
shot.
45,
he's a white
45.
Nationalist.
Oh, stop that.
He's a
Jamal.
nationalist.
No,
he's a
not.
white supremacist.
No, he's not, man.
He's anti-gay.
No,
he's
not.
anti-woman.
No,
he's anti-black.
Listen,
there's no way he can be president.
My former colleagues in the legislature,
Who's the other one? Who's the other
Republican
one?
and Democrat, when all that stuff was coming up last year, I called them. I said, tell me what's happening. They were like, it's really not that, but people are trying to raise a fuss. I've had the conversations. It's not true.
Who's the second guy? Who's the second guy? Second person?
Come on now. You already know that's Trump and Ron.
Trump and Ron?
Trump and Ron. That's two different people, man.
So Trump claims Florida now? He don't claim New York?
You know he been claimed Florida.
2 years now.
Been claimed.
Felicia.
It's very frustrating for me to sit here as a lifelong educator to listen to Republicans who do not have one former educator in their party on this committee talk about what we need to be doing in our schools and what we need to be doing when it comes to education. They supported the Trump tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans a few years ago and are now unwilling to even discuss making sure the wealthy among us contribute their fair share to the American economy and to education. They call themselves patriots. They claim to love America. How can they love America when they are not investing in our most precious resource, which is our children? If you really love America, you want to see America grow and thrive for decades to come. The best way to do that is to make sure our children and families have everything they need. The Supreme Court's decision, unfortunately, is not surprising because 3 of our court justices were chosen by one of the most, if not the most, racist president in American history, the former president, Donald Trump. He chose 3 of the Supreme Court justices. His slogan is to make America great again, take America back to a time when African Americans did not have the rights that we have fought for and died for throughout American history. I would like to speak in opposition to this amendment for several reasons. Number one, since New York City has been mentioned multiple times, and since my background is as an educator in New York City schools, I just want to highlight for everyone in the audience and my colleagues across the aisle that New York City is what we consider a Title I district. It's a school system that cannot survive without the Title I funds that come from the federal government. The reason why the federal government had to step in, I believe, in 1965 to provide Title I resources to lower income communities is because of redlining that was allowed by the federal government in past legislation, which led to the underfunding, the chronic underfunding of schools simply based on race. If you were Black or Latino in a particular community, your schools were underfunded, while schools in white suburban communities that had access to federal funds to buy housing, those schools received additional funding. So now this amendment seeks to double down on prior racist policy by implementing present-day racist policies in targeting of Title I school districts. I also want to take exception to the term invasion as we describe what's happening here with migrants coming to our country seeking asylum. There's a long history of that word invasion being used to describe migrants, particularly from Latino countries coming into our country by white supremacists in their fear-mongering around the arrival of immigrants in our country. So I take incredible exception to that word invasion. We are not being invaded. People are coming here to seek asylum, as is the history of the United States. Much of this anti-immigrant rhetoric and policy is aligned to something called the Great Replacement Theory, which was condemned by this Congress in last Congress, and I am proud to be the author of that resolution. The Great Replacement Theory states that the white race is under attack by blacks, Jews, and immigrants, and we must do something about it. And many of the mass shooters in our country have identified the Great Replacement Theory as being the motivating factor to their mass shooting, including the Buffalo mass shooting in upstate New York. So the hateful, divisive rhetoric is in the resolution. The hateful, divisive rhetoric is a part of one of the amendments. The hateful, divisive rhetoric is historical as per redlining, and the anti-immigrant sentiment is directly connected to the Great Replacement theory.
I want to remind the gentleman that you cannot engage in characterizing the other members' positions or calling their position, engaging in personality characterizations.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's just very frustrating because it seems like the legislation itself engages in personalities when it refers to a group of people that is derogatory. So if the legislation is doing it, and we're using words on the other side of the aisle like invasion, as if it's an army coming to our country, is that not personalities? Thank you, and I yield back. And I just want to ask a simple question. Why can't we leave trans people alone? Let them be who they are. Let them live their lives. Let's stop discriminating against them simply because they are different from who we are and different than what we understand. Just because we don't understand it doesn't mean we shouldn't support the transgender community and love them in the same way we should love all human beings. They're not bothering anyone. They want to go to school. They want to play sports. They want to hang out with their friends. They want to live their lives. Let them live their lives. We have an ugly history of discriminating against people who are different than we are throughout our time in this country. Whether they are Black, Latino, Asian, LGBTQ, poor, people with disabilities, women. We have an ugly history of discrimination in this country, and now the trans community is the target. What the heck who are we as Americans and as a human race to be so darn uncomfortable with an individual or group of people that's different from who we are? From the beginning of American history, as we got our stuff together, as we tried to, we invited people from all over the world to help us build the nation that we have now. And we continue to try to evolve into the nation that we're capable of being. And no one should be left out of that, especially not the trans community, which is the most vulnerable community right now in our country. Ms. Jayapal already shared some of the data, as did Ms. Bonamici, and as did Mr. Takano. I just want my Republican colleagues to just take a breath, stop, relax. The trans community isn't bothering you. Let them live. Just like you want your friends and family to live and have freedom and have rights and have choice, let the trans community have the same thing. Thank you, and I yield back. I want to zoom out for a moment because the Republican proposed budget seeks to cut $4.5 trillion overall, which will obviously have a huge impact on education. And while Republicans continue to speak about these budget cuts, they do not also speak about increased spending to invest more in our children and our families. We have a current economic system where two of the wealthiest Americans own more wealth than the bottom 50% of the country combined. So the wealthy are not contributing their fair share, and large corporations are not contributing their fair share, whereas at the same time, we're talking about budget cuts. So we're not having honest, holistic, comprehensive conversations. And it seems the Republican Party is going through a sort of cognitive dissonance, where on the one hand, they're speaking about caring about student learning, whereas on the other hand, their budget proposal will cut hundreds of thousands of teachers from our classrooms. On the one hand, they're speaking about caring about student mental health, where on the other hand, their budget proposal will cut thousands of mental health professionals from being in our schools. Their budget would also cut the arts and music and sports programs, not just in the Bronx and Mount Vernon in my district, but also in Arkansas, Ohio, Michigan, Florida, and will hurt not just urban black and brown kids, but rural white kids as well. Rural white kids love music. They would love to learn how to play an instrument. They would love to have theater, drama, and arts programs in their schools, and they would love to participate in a holistic, comprehensive education program. But unfortunately, because local property taxes fund our schools more than anything else, wealthy kids continue to get the things that poor rural kids do not get and poor urban kids do not get. At the same time, they want to cut SNAP benefits. They want to cut $4 billion from Title I schools. These are the poorest, most vulnerable people. If we put them in desperate situations, they will turn to doing something that will harm their community, which is crime. Their budget also cuts hundreds of thousands of law enforcement officers. So now we don't have the resources to respond to our kids on the front end or the back end, and we're leaving our families to suffer. My question is this: speak to us about the impact of these cuts and how they'll contribute to the school to prison pipeline, and talk about how community schools can be a response to that.
Sure. You know,
The gentleman has 20 seconds.
as the president said, show me your budget and I'll show you your values. It costs more to intervene and incarcerate than it does to educate. We're either going to pay now or pay later. We need to invest in our children and invest in our country.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. It's painfully obvious to myself, my colleagues, and the American people that the Republican Party is deeply unserious and unable to legislate. Their censure resolution against me today continues to demonstrate their inability to govern and serve the American people. Over the last 3 years, I have tirelessly fought for my district and my constituents by bringing over $125 million to the district, helping save members of our community over $7 million, and resolving over 6,500 constituent casework issues. I've introduced over 50 bills, resolutions, and amendments, and had 2 bills on STEM education passed in the historic CHIPS and Science Act. Even today, as Republicans force a censure on me, I introduced a new bill, the College Athlete Right to Organize Act, to ensure college athletes get paid for their time and hard work. No matter the result of the censure vote tomorrow, my constituents know I will always continue to fight for them. Fighting for my district includes working to prevent a government shutdown. And just over 2 months ago, I was rushing to the Capitol to vote and prevent a Republican shutdown. When I tried to exit a door that I usually go through, it didn't open, and due to confusion and rush to go vote, I pulled the fire alarm. I immediately took responsibility and accountability for my actions and pled guilty. Immediately. The legal process on this matter has played out. In no way did I obstruct official proceedings. The vote took place, and Democrats were able to ensure we avoided a government shutdown. Unfortunately, Republicans are here trying to rehash an already litigated matter, a matter in which the Republican-controlled House Committee on Ethics decided not to proceed with any further investigation. This is an insult to the people I was elected to represent. Instead of passing meaningful legislation for the American people, some Republicans are using this censure to waste our time and money and to try and make you forget about all of the rights they want to destroy. They're trying to make you forget they want to take away your reproductive rights, your voting rights, your health care, your Social Security, and your Medicare. House Democrats have been trying to focus on and address the issues the American people care about. Can we please, 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 please address the affordability crisis?
1 minute.
Thank you.
Gentleman is recognized.
Millions of Americans are struggling to put food on the tables, pay their rent, and keep the electricity on. Can we address the issue of gun violence? Just this week, we broke the record for the most mass shootings in a year, and we've lost over 35,000 people due to gun violence. Can we address our crumbling public school infrastructure? Kids are learning in schools with asbestos, no air conditioning, and mold, and it's hurting their ability to learn, grow, and thrive. Can we put an end to our massive spending on weapons and war and instead invest in our communities and our kids? The number one thing I tried to do as a middle school principal and as an educator for 20 years was to teach my students when they made a mistake, they owned up to it, they took responsibility, and they held themselves accountable. That's exactly what I did, and yet we are still here. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Before I get started on my questions, I just want to start with this simple one. And this is to everyone in the chamber, not just to our witnesses. Raise your hand if you lost someone due to COVID or you know someone who lost someone due to COVID. Raise your hand. Okay, that's like the whole chamber. Okay. COVID killed 1.135 million Americans and counting. That's more Americans that were killed during the Civil War and World War II combined in a shorter period of time. Let's say we would have kept the schools open. Isn't it likely, yes, kids were not as harmed as other people, but kids are taught by teachers who may have some immunocompromised situation going on. Kids go home to parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles and live in the community and travel. So while kids may have not been seriously sick or killed by COVID, they can pass the illness on to others who will then die from COVID. This is well documented. That being said, I think it's fair to say if we would have kept schools open, more people would have died due to COVID. So we're talking here about learning loss, which is the incorrect term, by the way. The more correct term is learning disruption or disrupted learning. I encourage you all to review an ACE study that was done in the medical field several decades ago. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. ACEs, the study shows that toxic stress and complex trauma impacts the brain's development in people 18 years of age and younger. Look up the study. The world experienced a complex trauma, which is going to impact the brain's development, particularly the prefrontal cortex. If that has happened to our kids and then they go back to school, of course you're going to see disruptions in learning. There is another pandemic that has been going on since the beginning of American history, and that is the underinvestment and disinvestment in poor schools, in poor communities, particularly black and brown. That is a pandemic that was here way before COVID, which is why we see an achievement gap in our schools and why kids in wealthier school communities do better than other kids. And now we're having a conversation behaving as if we're really concerned about learning loss, while my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to cut funding to Title I, to community schools, and to resources for our most vulnerable people, especially those who receive SNAP and TANF benefits. What are we talking about? We're not being honest about the full conversation here. And so if learning loss is something we really care about, and again, it's the wrong term, it's disrupted learning, we need to invest in our teachers, invest in our children, and invest in our schools and communities that have been historically neglected. And I'll close with this, and Ms. Ray, I'm going to try to give you a moment to respond to my comments. I'm sorry I went too long. But I don't know where we're getting this idea of this disrupted learning is going to lead to generations falling behind. I have a doctorate in educational leadership from Manhattanville College. I ran a middle school for 10 and a half years. In 2016, my middle school had the #1 growth scores of any middle school in New York City. We moved kids from level 1 to level 3 on standardized tests at a higher rate than anyone else in New York City. We did that in 1 year. Why are we talking about generations? We need to have a conversation about how learning works and be honest about that in this committee. And I hate standardized tests, by the way. We need project-based learning and more holistic learning in our schools that includes the arts and sports and tech and things that kids actually care about and actually contribute to a 21st century economy. Sorry, my time is up. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to discuss my amendment to the Fiscal Year 24 National Defense Authorization Act Rules Amendment number 778. My amendment is very simple. It would reinvest $157 billion from our defense budget into our public education system. Now, many of my colleagues may balk at that number. However, I want to remind everyone that we spend more on our national defense than the next 10 countries combined. We are secure as a nation in our military might because we have consistently supported the military-industrial complex. But where we have neglected mightily is another pillar of our democracy, which is our education system and our public school system. As we continue to neglect our public schools, we are harming our most precious and most vulnerable resource, which is our nation's children. Historically, this neglect is well documented, from redlining communities, underfunding public housing, underfunding green spaces, and underfunding schools in historically marginalized communities. Before coming to Congress, I had the pleasure and privilege of working in our public schools for 20 years. I served as an elementary school teacher in the South Bronx before becoming a high school guidance counselor and dean of students, where I served for 3.5 years. Realizing that our schools weren't doing enough to unlock the unlimited potential of our kids, I wrote a proposal and opened up a public middle school in the Northeast Bronx, where I served for 10.5 years as its principal. And my mission, our mission as a school, was simple. Listen to our students, listen to our families, respond to the community's needs, because that is what is necessary to unlock the magic, magnificence, and brilliance of our kids. And I scoured the earth to find additional grants and resources to bring into our school. And we didn't just invest in traditional curriculum. We invested in the holistic development of our kids. Now, what does that mean? That means we made sure, yes, we focused on language arts. Yes, we focused on mathematics. Yes, we focused on science. But we also focused on STEM and STEAM and music and the arts and play and gym and mental health supports and food security and adult education and everything to ensure the full development of our students and support for their families. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, to the House chamber and to America, education, I argue, is the #1 national security issue in our country. Thank you very much, Representative Sherfless McCormick, and thank you for your leadership, and thank you for bringing together the CBC this evening to once again discuss racism in America. how long are we going to have this conversation? It seems like day after day, month after month, year after year, since 1619, we have had to have this conversation in some context. This Supreme Court has now become a Supreme Court that legislates as opposed to a Supreme Court that simply implements the pillars of our Constitution. The same Supreme Court that rolled back Roe v. Wade not too long ago, that is now making it easier to carry concealed weapons in Democrat-led states with strong gun laws like New York. The same Supreme Court that says it's okay to turn away LGBTQ customers if you do not want to do work for that particular demographic. This Supreme Court has gone rogue, and this Supreme Court has lost its legitimacy. Look at the reports. Members of the Supreme Court receiving gifts from billionaire donors over the course of their careers. Members of the Supreme Court allowing billionaire conservative donors to pay for their children's tuition as they attend private schools. This is unacceptable, this is unethical, and there are members of the Supreme Court who should immediately resign or be impeached because of taking these gifts from conservative billionaire donors. So these recent decisions, rolling back Roe v. Wade, and definitely one as it relates to affirmative action, are in alignment with MAGA Republicans and the extreme conservative Republicans in our country. And notice the hypocrisy, notice the disgusting decision to use the 14th Amendment, which was designed to protect the civil rights and citizenship of newly freed slaves. They used that argument to now take away rights from African Americans as it refers to entry into our most prestigious institutions. This decision is going to prohibit millions of African Americans across this country who are brilliant from receiving the same access and opportunity as their white peers. And I think all of that is captured in this chart behind me when we look at the issue of wealth inequality in America. Look at this chart, the median family wealth gap. The average white family median income is $171,000. When you compare that to the average black family, the median income in the average black family is $14,409. Average Hispanic family, $20,920. It's the consistent attack on black and Latino communities that contribute to this wealth gap. It's not just the affirmative action decision in terms of the higher education institutions of America. It's also as it relates to employment opportunities, to career opportunities, to private investment in black and Latino businesses, to the federal budget and where our money is allocated towards right here in this body, the United States House of Representatives. It goes back to the issue of globalization and blue-collar jobs leaving black and brown communities as part of a race to the bottom for profit based on low-cost labor in other countries. When those factory jobs left our country and left black and Latino communities, nothing replaced those jobs. As a matter of fact, I've misspoken. Something did replace those jobs. Heroin, the numbers game, crack cocaine replaced those jobs. You know what else replaced those jobs? Law enforcement. So you take away access and opportunity from a jobs perspective, from an economic perspective, from a higher education perspective. And also, by the way, because of our support of redlining black communities, the white middle class in the 1930s and 40s were able to buy homes, very low interest rates, very low costs, move to the suburbs, out of public housing, and build their wealth. You know who was forced to stay in public housing? African Americans and Latinos. And those communities were considered devalued, less valuable because of the race of the people who lived there. So this is historic. This is not just the enslavement of Africans, not just Jim Crow, not just the black laws, not just the Homestead Act. This is redlining. This is the Iran-Contra scandal and drugs in our community. And now in 2023, we continue to have these conversations because of the Supreme Court's recent decision. But I'm also here to say, we in the Congressional Black Caucus and we as African Americans across this country, these setbacks are only that. They are only setbacks. Each setback makes us stronger, makes us more powerful, makes us more united, and gives us a deeper sense of commitment and self-determination as we work to reclaim our black sovereignty, not just here in America, but throughout the African diaspora, in the Caribbean, on the continent of Africa, and on Central and South America. We don't die, we multiply. And we will continue to multiply exponentially as we weather this storm, grow our enrollment in historically black colleges. Shout out to HBCUs for doing the great work that they do. So that's going to grow. But we also are going to let our voices be heard as we vote with our feet and we go to the polls next year. Because we have to bring transformational change to the United States of America. We have to build a nation that works for everybody, and right now we do not have that nation. And I'll close with this. The Supreme Court has not only revealed its illegitimacy through receiving gifts from billionaire conservative donors. We have to look at complete Supreme Court reform as it relates to ethics reform, ending lifetime appointments, but also we need to look at the size of the Supreme Court. It's time to expand the court beyond the 9 members. This 9-member Supreme Court has been in place since 1869. America was 30 million people in 1869. It is now 330 million people, over 10 times the size. There are 7,000 cases presented to the Supreme Court every single year. They only hear 80 of them. They do not have the capacity to respond to the complexity and diversity and the nuance that is American society today. So it's time for democracy reform, and it begins with the Supreme Court. It also begins with the Electoral College. It also begins with ending the filibuster. And we change all that by voting the right people in the office and getting the wrong ones out of office. Thank you so much for your time, and I yield back.